Hello and welcome to this webinar on CCS, a new approach to ESG and reporting. My name is Alex Apandis. I'm the General Manager Commercial at the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, and I'll be the Master of Ceremonies for today's webinar. We've got a great event today, excuse me, covering the topic of ESG and CCS, with an excellent list of speakers joining us from all around the world. Now, one of the global macro trends of the past decade has been the rise of ESG investment. ESG reporting and rating schemes have proliferated to meet demand for information on how companies are contributing to good environmental, social and governance outcomes. The work that will be presented today, completed by the Global CCS Institute, explores how carbon capture and storage is reported under existing ESG reporting frameworks. The report then develops an ESG reporting methodology for CCS intended to provide robust investment-grade information that investors and financiers demand. Tonight's event is co-hosted by the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Centre, or KAPSARC as it's known, and the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative. KAPSARC is a leading think tank located in Riyadh in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with a mission to advance Saudi Arabia's energy sector and inform global policies on energy, economics and the environment. The CEM CCUS initiative has an objective of accelerating CCUS as a viable carbon dioxide mitigation option, bringing together government, industry, and the financial and investment sectors. We're very fortunate to be joined by 6 excellent speakers and panelists who are all very well qualified to provide informed perspectives on ESG and CCS. Those speakers are Adam Sieminski, Senior Advisor to the Board of King of KAPSARC, Juho Lipponen, the Coordinator of the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, Ian Havercroft, who's Principal Consultant, Policy, Legal and Regulatory at the Global CCS Institute, Fatih Yilmaz, a Research Fellow in the Climate and Sustainability Program at KAPSARC, Steve Shofield, Head of Climate and Carbon Policy and Advocacy at Shell, and Mark Sisouw de Silva, the Managing Director of Energy at ING. So Adam Sieminski and Juho Lipponen will make some brief opening remarks to set the context for today's presentation, and then Ian Havercroft will present the report on ESG and CCS. Following this, we have some time for questions and a discussion. So please record your questions using the Q&A panel, and I'll get to as many of them as I can at the end. Okay, so our first speaker is Adam Sieminski. Adam, please turn on your camera and your audio now. Adam, as I mentioned, is the Senior Advisor to the Board of the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Centre. He served as the President of KAPSARC from 2018 until August 2021. And before that, he held the Schlesinger Chair for Energy and Geopolitics at CSIS. From 2012 through 2016, he served as Head of the US Energy Information Administration. And while he was awaiting Senate confirmation for that role, he was Senior Director for Energy and Environment at the US National Security Council. Earlier than that, he was Deutsche Bank's Chief Energy Economist and Integrated Oil Company Analyst, working in Baltimore, London, New York, and Washington. Adam holds the CFA designation and earned a degree in civil engineering and a master's in public administration, both from Cornell University. So over to you, Adam, for some opening remarks, please. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Alex. I'd like to first compliment GCCSI for publishing this very important report. If the world is truly going to make significant progress in dealing with the challenges of climate change, it will be critical to take a holistic and pragmatic approach that supports a broad array of technologies and policies. The Institute's work on developing an ESG reporting methodology to support CCS-related investments is foundational to moving forward. KAPSARC is delighted to have had this second opportunity to cooperate with GCCSI to support and encourage dialogue on issues related to carbon management. In August of 2020, the Institute authored an important report on CCS as part of the Circular Carbon Economy Guide that also had input from the IEA in Paris, IRENA, the Renewable Energy Agency, the Nuclear Energy Agency, and the OECD Policy Office. The CCE framework was subsequently endorsed by the G20 summit leaders at the end of 2020. And now this year, the UN International Panel on Climate Change has endorsed the vital role that carbon capture and storage must play as a climate solution. As Alex mentioned, KAPSARC is a non-government, non-profit advisory think tank located in Riyadh. We aspire to be the trusted advisor to the local energy ecosystem, but to remain as a recognized thought leader among energy policy think tanks globally. We believe that events such as today's are a crucial part of focusing attention on energy issues that really matter. In closing, I want to say thank you to all of the presenters and attendees for participating in the webinar, and now over to Juho. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for those comments, Adam. And I've got to say I agree wholeheartedly with the importance of this issue in terms of ensuring we do have a steady transition towards a zero emissions future. So Juho Lipponen is the coordinator of the Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative, and he'll now make some opening remarks. Juho, please turn your camera on if not already. Juho works closely with the co-chairs and all 13 initiative members and is responsible for the day-to-day running of all of the activities of that initiative. Prior to this, between 2010 and 2018, Juho was head of the Carbon Capture and Storage Unit at the International Energy Agency and acting head of Energy Technology Policy Division at the IEA. Before joining the IEA, Juho held several positions at Eurelectric in Brussels. He has a Master of Science in Political Science, Economics and Constitutional Law from the University of Turku, Finland, and he's based right now in Paris, France. So welcome, Juho. Please make some comments. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Alex, and hello, everybody. Welcome to this event. Thank you, our colleagues at GCCSI, for the invitation and the collaboration on this event. This is really interesting and topical, and also kudos to KAPSARC for sponsoring this important work. The SEM CCUS initiative is a group of governments that try to accelerate CCUS together. And accelerating CCUS, I think, is synonymous in many ways to accelerating financing for CCUS. And you cannot really talk about accelerating if you don't include finance aspects to those discussions. That's also why the SEM initiative has made a conscious effort over the past couple of years to link up with the finance sector players, both multilateral development banks, but also other types of banks, commercial banks and other investors, to learn about their views and appetite for CCUS investment. We published a set of key financing principles on this topic coming 2 years ago now, and that's still out there, hopefully serving as an inspiration for the finance issues. Now, ESG for us obviously is part of this wider finance sector theme and engagement. And of course, ESG is not only an issue for banks. In fact, it's even more an issue for industries and economic actors who seek the financing for their activities. And if we think of energy transformation framework more widely, I think people often think that much of it needs to happen via regulation by government. Partly true, but not the whole truth. And I think governments in the SEM initiative are also conscious of the increasing role that the finance sector plays in accelerating financing for sustainable activities, and in turn accelerating the energy sector transformation. And this, of course, is where ESG frameworks come into play and play a key role. So we also really welcome the work done on ESG by the Global CCS Institute. I think the reports published are the 2 first papers on this topic ever, anywhere. So it's groundbreaking. And I think it's nice to be at the beginning of a journey to start defining what CCS can do for ESG and vice versa. So welcome to everybody, and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those comments, Juho. And I think someone once said CCS doesn't have a cost problem, it has a finance problem. So the importance of finance really is at the center of the challenge that CCS faces going forwards. Okay, so now on to the main event, so to speak. Ian, have you got your camera on? You have, very good. Thank you very much. So Ian will be presenting the thought leadership report that the Institute has produced. Ian is our principal consultant for policy, legal and regulatory. Prior to working for the Institute, Ian has worked in academia, in chambers, and as a consultant on legal issues. A reminder, we are going to have time for questions and answers at the end of Ian's presentation. Please record any questions you might have in the Q&A panel that you should see in the Zoom window, and I'll get to as many of those as I can after the presentation. So Ian, over to you. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Alex. Can you see my slides, hopefully?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you. And welcome, everybody. I'm pleased to be able to present this report. Just very quickly, I'm going to provide just a quick overview of the project and the background to this. And I should start by thanking my co-authors on this report, Alex, who you've heard from, and also Nabila Raji, who's a member of the commercial team here at the Institute. This project really builds upon some of the work, as Juho mentioned in his initial comments, that we completed back in 2020, and is aimed at further examining the relationship between carbon capture and storage and ESG rating and reporting schemes. We're delighted that this particular project was supported by the KAPSARC team, and thank you to Adam and his colleagues for their interest in supporting us in this work. Essentially, this project goes beyond our earlier 2020 Thought Leadership report that we completed for the US DOE and started to look in greater detail as to where the benefits of CCS deployment can be leveraged within ESG schemes or broader reporting schemes. And we've tried to take that one step further to propose a CCS specific methodology, which we hope will help a range of stakeholders in their understanding of the type of information that may be reported as part of these activities. So firstly, what we did in completing this report is start by examining the range of reporting schemes, rating schemes, and reporting methodologies that are currently out there. It's important to note that even since the 2020 report, there has been an increased number of these schemes coming to market, and indeed significant interest. As I've highlighted in my first point, not only investor scrutiny and regulatory intervention are driving the uptake of these rating schemes and more reporting methodologies, we're also seeing an increasing appetite from the public more broadly about issues in the ESG space. The interest in this particular topic is reflected in the number of schemes that are being developed. And in particular, there's a variety of what we've termed voluntary and non-voluntary reporting schemes, those which are part of a broader reporting package, such as the TCFD, for example, would fall within the voluntary category. Non-voluntary are perhaps those more commercial schemes provided by third-party ratings providers, MSCI, Sustainalytics would just be two examples. What we have found is that companies are inevitably finding that they are covered both voluntarily and involuntarily by these various rating schemes. And in the latter case, particularly where there is a requirement starting to emerge within some of the regulatory frameworks that govern reporting around the world for corporate organizations, which are requesting or almost mandating now that companies utilize a particular reporting framework. Particularly relevant to carbon capture and storage is the role of climate-related factors and how they have found themselves being included within the ESG reporting frameworks. Climate-related factors have in fact become synonymous with the E pillar of the ESG acronym, and we found that there is increasing interest in this particular element. All of the schemes that we've considered, particularly the reporting standards, such as the TCFD, obviously, and things like the CPD, all reflect this incredibly strong focus that we're seeing upon climate factors. And what we have noted is that there are increasing levels of sophistication required in the types of information to be provided in these particular schemes. So since the previous report in 2019-2020, when I was conducting the research for that, we have noted some really quite fast-paced changes to the reporting landscape. And many of these were highlighted in some of the interviews that I conducted in the commissioning and in the research associated with this particular report. One of this slide highlights a few of those critical issues that we're starting to see. And the first perhaps is, as I've mentioned in my previous slide, the role of regulatory intervention that's emerging around the world. And there are several jurisdictions where we are now seeing regulators requiring some form of climate-related reporting as part of a company's reporting activities. That first quote, which I've highlighted, which is in the green sub-point there, is actually taken from the group of 7 finance ministers statement from 2021. Beyond just the reporting of climate issues, we're now seeing an increased focus upon net zero commitments. And this is starting to form the basis of many investment and lending strategies. Again, as we spoke to a number of stakeholders as part of our research for this report, we noted that particularly amongst the investment and finance community, many are transitioning their portfolios and now starting to consider exactly how the organizations that they fund will address their net zero commitments. And there is a strong emphasis in this regard upon looking at measurable and science-based approaches to the targets that have been set. This is a really very critical factor, and this was an issue that was highlighted time and time again during the discussions. Beyond the E pillar that I've highlighted previously, we are now, in the past couple of years, also seeing a prominence of broader social or S factor considerations. And this is particularly following, or I shouldn't say following, but in the sort of post-COVID recovery period, where there's been a strong emphasis upon funding provided by governments, for example, in relation to supporting jobs and employment. And we've started to see, certainly in the ESG literature and the statements made by governments, for example, that there is a strong focus upon the balance of socioeconomic and climate considerations. And we note that in particular in the United States, where the Biden administration made the link between climate and jobs. One of the other areas where there has been strong focus upon ESG has been in relation to greenwashing, and has been a particularly strong criticism from a number of stakeholders around the role that ESG may play for companies that are trying to perhaps hide their activities. This has been highlighted particularly in relation to some of the climate-related disclosures that are being issued. And what's being called for by many parties is much stricter regulation of the sector to address these concerns. And finally, perhaps one of the most significant areas is the call for greater standardization and harmonization of ESG reporting schemes. We've spoke to a number of people and they've all highlighted the fact that they are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of schemes, the requirements that are placed upon them, and the number of issues to be considered by companies. What we are seeing, however, are international efforts, and I note here particularly the work of the ISSB, who have launched a consultation around and proposed 2 individual standards, including one on climate-related disclosures. So that will be an important issue to consider in the future. Looking at where CCS fits within current reporting models was really the basis of our analysis. And here we started to consider, as I've highlighted in this first point, the extent to which carbon capture and storage was included within the various reporting schemes and ratings methodologies. We focused in particular upon 15 of the most prominent voluntary reporting standards, all of which had a focus upon climate-related reporting. And here we identified some broad reporting requirements within these schemes where CCS was likely to be relevant. From this, we distilled a number of reporting requirements into 6 general themes, and I've highlighted those in the green numbered 1 to 6 items there in my second bullet point. What we observed in this analysis, and you can see this within our report, which I'll highlight at the end of my presentation again, there's some very, very detailed tables within the report that provide examples of how this has been addressed. But what we noted specifically is that while CCS is not explicitly excluded from these various standards and schemes, and there are in fact quite a number of opportunities for reporting CCS activities within an organization's climate risk mitigation strategy or activities associated with that. It is perhaps not exactly clear or exactly how much detail can be provided in relation to this. What we've really found is that CCS may be better represented within the ESG and reporting landscape, and there may be further opportunities to really build upon this. So it was in this context that we started to look at developing a CCS-specific reporting methodology. And again, based upon our analysis and research and interviews that we conducted with the finance community, the reporting sector, and indeed those companies with a significant CO2 footprint that utilize many of these reporting frameworks, we started to frame how we would approach this particular methodology. And in this slide, I've provided a little bit of context as to the critical issues that we try to address. We noted that there is certainly, as I highlighted in my previous comments, a demand for very high quality and more fulsome disclosure in relation to climate. And it's in this context that we needed to consider how carbon capture and storage activities could be contained within some of the existing reporting frameworks. There is certainly, as I mentioned before, an expectation now that the quality of the information provided by an organization needs to continue to rise and also needs to be more fulsome and address some of the issues that we are starting to see as necessary for financiers and the wider public. And as I've highlighted in my third bullet point here, there's a need for greater quantitative information as part of these disclosures. We noted that companies themselves, particularly those with significant emissions exposure, are really under quite a significant amount of pressure to report as part of a range of reporting schemes. Many of the organizations we spoke to highlighted the fact that this is highly resource intensive, it's very time consuming, and in some instances they're facing pressure from those investors and financiers to actually utilize particular reporting schemes and standards. Again, they also highlighted the new area where greater information is being sought, which is in relation to net zero, and their approach that they're taking to this particular issue. This is something that, again, is being highlighted by a range of different stakeholders. And then finally, and as I alluded to in my previous slide, while CCS is not explicitly excluded, we do need a clearer reporting pathway. There are very few examples of where CCS is explicitly included within some of these reporting methodologies. There is a wide variety of schemes and there's a large amount of inconsistency between the types of information to be provided. And where we are seeing net zero commitments and where these are likely to rely upon CCS, we're pretty sure that there is going to be more detailed reporting necessary to satisfy the requirements of the investment community. So in this context, we have developed a CCS-specific reporting methodology, and obviously in the interest of time, it's not possible for me to take you through the pages of this methodology which are included in our report. What I've done, and you'll be able to see on the right-hand side of this slide, is just highlight how we've approached this and what it actually looks like within its the tabular representation in the form, in the report, sorry. What we did here was build our methodology around the 6 issues that we highlighted previously, the general themes that were identified within existing reports. What we did decide was that in addition to the reporting of climate risk, we recognize that CCS specific reporting would need to consider broader range of factors. the quantification of reductions, the governance arrangements that would support carbon capture and storage activities in a particular jurisdiction where a project is operating, for example, are just two examples and are included within this methodology. Our reason for adopting the approach that we have chosen is really in line with the movement towards greater standardization that I highlighted and that we're seeing, particularly at levels, at the international level, for example, within the ISSB. We decided that it would be useful to take the critical elements and reporting pathways found in existing reporting frameworks and ESG pathways and really build CCS CCS reporting within those particular pathways. So it provides familiarity, but also enabled flexibility as to how companies could potentially operate this. And as I've highlighted in my third point here, the aim really was to provide a methodology that could be utilized by all parties, operators, end users of information, and those designing reporting schemes, really to emphasize how carbon capture and storage could be successfully included within all these schemes. So noting the time, I shall provide some just high-level conclusions. As I mentioned, we've seen a very rapidly changing ESG sector. It clearly is a fundamental aspect now of all commercial activities, with strong focus and emphasis placed upon it by many sectors. The role of low carbon technologies within ESG reporting is facing increased scrutiny, particularly in light of net zero commitments that are being made. What is being sought by both the finance community and the wider public is greater granularity as to the type of information that's provided and the level of detail that they deem will be necessary to meet some of the requirements of their investment criteria. For companies that are reporting under these schemes, it's applying greater pressure to them to choose the right scheme and provide the right type of information that will satisfy the requirements of investors. For CCS specifically, it poses perhaps some unique challenges where we don't really see a specific high singular methodology that really allows a company to report in a fulsome manner. And in that, with that statement, I commend the methodology that we've developed as a starting point for a conversation, and one which I hope will prove useful for the CCS community. This is my final slide with my email address and the front cover to our report, which is available from the Institute's website. And on that, I shall hand back to Alex. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that, Ian. Certainly a lot to consider, and you're on time. In fact, you've saved us a bit of time, so very well done. So we have some time now for some questions for our panel, but first I must properly introduce the other panelists who will now join Adam, Juho, and Ian. So panelists, you can please activate your cameras and audio now. Fatih Yilmaz is a research fellow in the Climate and Sustainability Program at KAPSARC, where his current research agenda focuses on climate change, sustainable finance, and ESG. Fatih has over 10 years of research and policy experience across the finance sector. He's widely published academic, has a PhD in economics from the University of Calgary. Our next panelist is Steve Shofield. He's head of climate and carbon policy and advocacy, part of Shell's corporate relations team. Steve has led Shell's engagement on international climate discussions and has developed some of the company's positions on key issues. He has a long history in climate and energy, ranging across government, NGOs, and the private sector, has master's degrees in international relations and climate change, and a degree in geology and geography. Mark Sisouw de Silva is our next panelist. He's managing director at Energy at ING. Mark has been with ING for over 20 years and heads the technical team which advises the ING's global upstream financing team and supports ING's energy financing globally. Over the years, Mark has also been involved as a deal principal in various structured financings in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and in Europe. His team is actively supporting project financing initiatives on new technology projects in the field of CCS and hydrogen right now. Mark holds a master's degree in petroleum engineering and from Delft University. Okay, so all of our panelists should have their cameras on. Time for some questions. So perhaps the first question should be for Mark. Mark, in the context of ESG, how is the finance sector considering carbon capture and storage?
Okay, Alex, thanks a lot. Yeah, and also Ian, very good presentation. To be honest, what you indicate is we recognize as an institution very well the movement towards net zero, and also adjusting our portfolios to a philosophy. So that is spot on and very recent. Yeah, you know, ING is one of the leading global energy finance banks, and for us, CCS is a very important part of the carbon reduction initiative. We see now around 80% of the emission reduction, according Bloomberg New Energy Finance, is to be coming from CCS. So it is a real big part. It basically increases a bit over time. And what we now see is that CCS, you know, it's part of a project of common interest. The projects that we are now looking at, like Portos and Aramis, being done in the North Sea. They are part of a project of common interest for EU. They fall under EU Green Taxonomy. In the Dutch environment, it is also part of the coalition agreement between the governing parties, the political parties. So what we see is that there's quite a lot of appetite from the financing sector to support these upcoming projects. In the past, it was less so, but now what we see is there's a lot of interest to support these, and I think it's really part of the solution. And as an example, our bank, ING, has a considerable capital envelope dedicated specifically for CC. That's what I would like to say about this.
Sorry, Mark, you just dropped out for a second there. Just your last sentence. Would you like to repeat just your last sentence? Sorry.
Yeah, what is important, I think, as an example of our commitment to these technologies, is that that ING has developed a big envelope, a capital envelope, considerable amount that we can immediately spend to bankable projects like CCS or other new technologies.
I guess that's the ultimate test, isn't it? Absolutely clear. Thank you. So if you know, financiers have funds available that they're waiting to allocate to sound projects, that's certainly indicative of growing support. Fatih, what's your view on this issue? As a researcher, you might have a slightly different perspective. How are you seeing the finance sector reacting to considering carbon capture and storage in the context of, you know, managing ESG risk?
Thanks, Alex. Hello, everyone. I would like to first congratulate the IN and the rest of the research team at the Global CCS Institute for the release of a very timely, relevant, and comprehensive report on the ESG consideration of the CCUS technologies. Well, before going directly into your question, I would like to make a couple remarks on the investment gaps on the CCUS, just to feed the discussion here. The first one is if you look at the recent studies by various institutions, such as the IEA, on the required level of CCUS investments under different transition scenarios to achieve net zero, they provide quite different numbers. However, the bottom line is the figures are very big. We're talking about multiple tens or hundreds of billions of US dollars annual investment needed to achieve net zero. However, if you look at for instance, Bloomberg data for the recent CCUS investment flows, that's only a few $1 billion annually, which is, you know, far from the required figures. So overall, there's a very large investment gap exists with regard to the CCS technologies. The second point that I would like to make is that developing countries are currently out of the picture. They haven't utilized the technology much, despite the fact that many of the developing countries actually, their economies, their economic structure are much more carbon intensive or based on basically hard to abate sectors. For instance, take the example of China and India alone. They account for more than half of the global steel and cement production, just to these two countries, despite the fact that their current penetration of the CCS technologies is very trivial. So there are obviously different explanations in the literature for the low utilization, or for the current low utilization of the CCUS technologies globally. Mentioning things like the cost efficiency, regulatory support, etc. Particularly finance has been taking the most attention, being the key factor slowing down the utilization of the technology, especially in the case of developing economies. I mean, we do understand that the CCUS technologies are capital intensive, and they simply need a very large upfront capital investment. However, to scale up the technology, we basically need to kick in the finance factor into the picture. Well, as the ESG is becoming the new norm for the transition finance, it can definitely play a very important key role to bridge the investment gaps that I've been talking about in the case of developed and the developing economies. But there are bottlenecks, obviously. Currently, if you look at the most of the transition investment and finance literature, you tend to see that the mainstream mitigation technologies, such as renewable energy and electrification, seem to get more attention among the financial community, obviously, perhaps mostly due to the rising interest among their shareholders, based on the view of I will say, a more restrictive definition of the current energy transition. Concerns like greenwashing surrounding the CCS technologies are worth mentioning here. However, I think more explicit coverage of CCS technologies under the ESG guidelines, such as the Global CCS Institute's suggested methodology, can certainly help bridging this understanding gap, as well as the investment gaps. Additionally, I should also mention one important feature that the CCUS technologies can bring on the table, which is the asset stranding as a result of a fast transition scenario, is also an important concern to the global financial stability, and financial people do have a very good understanding of this problem. And CCS technologies can provide an interim solution here by decarbonizing the current heavy carbon infrastructure, which hasn't been actually widely discussed and recognized. So we basically need more discussion and studies on this front to raise awareness among the financial people, especially. I mean, when we look at the developing economies, the picture is little blur, I will say, where there is basically a serious need to establish the local ESG infrastructures and link these infrastructures to the global markets. So far, developing countries have not attracted much ESG flows, with a few exceptions like China. But I'm afraid that if they cannot keep up with the current trend, they will experience further difficulties in getting their fair share of global ESG flows. I mean, this is my quick.
Okay, thanks, Patty. There was a lot. There was a lot in that answer. So very, very comprehensive answer. You did mention at one point that ESG was playing a stronger role in essentially in supporting investment in CCS. I wouldn't mind exploring that, perhaps with Steve. Steve, can I ask you, to what extent are ESG considerations supporting the business case for investment in CCS? For marginal projects, or perhaps projects that might even be slightly NPV negative. I mean, are ESG considerations actually materially helping these projects to get over the line? Stephen Shofield?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for the opportunity to participate today in a great panel, and also for the report. Congratulations on that and all the hard work that's gone into that. Maybe just to say first that we Shell believe CCS is important to help us to meet our net zero target, our net zero 2050 target. And that's through reducing emissions from our own operations, as well as decarbonising sectors, and some of those have been mentioned, like steel, and then producing low carbon fuels like hydrogen. And as has already been mentioned, of course, in if not all but most of the scenarios for how the world meets Paris, it's a key element. We also believe, that ESG has an important role in action on climate, and so we've actively supported initiatives like the TCFD. And in so doing, we already do disclose some detail around our CCS activities. So, for example, we have a target of 25 million tonnes per annum of CCS capacity by the middle of next decade. We report on our CCS quantities for those that are active projects that are already out there. So, for example, the Quest project in Canada, which has been operating for about 6 years now, we actively report the quantity stored. And we've also disclosed a number of projects that have met a certain standard of maturity through going through our sort of assessment process. Some of those have been mentioned earlier, such as those in the Netherlands, Portos, for example. I think in terms of the role of ESG in the decision making, so I would say that it's clearly embedded in our overall strategy, and that's the sort of key point, I think. So, and by that, it then helps to define our capital allocation framework, which would then allow us to meet that strategy or those strategic goals. So it's really starting to sort of drive that, both the strategy but also the allocation, in the same way as you'd expect company strategies have always driven, capital allocation decisions. And that capital allocation approach is over time to shift capital from, our traditional business, if you like, our upstream business, into new growth business areas as we see the energy transition accelerate and we sell more low carbon products. So I do think that it, is playing a role at a strategy level and a capital allocation level. And as I said, we're already disclosing what we are doing in a number of areas. I think, having said that, bringing CCS to scale, which will be required to meet both our climate targets, but also, as I mentioned, more globally, really requires us to develop more projects ultimately and drive down those costs and create new business models. And I think, it will continue to be also a key component of that will be around policies to drive that, policy and regulation to drive that. So I would say that the ESG element is coming in at the strategy level, but we're still seeing sort of CCS being really driven quite heavily through sort of public policy and regulation at the more project level. Hope that answers.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. And I think Shell is probably one of the leaders when it comes to reporting publicly its commitments to transitioning and to its activities, investments in all sorts of low emission technologies. One of the things that we found in doing this work is there's great variability in what is reported by different companies under different reporting regimes. And that creates difficulty for people who aren't very close to the issue, who are looking for common metrics and common measures that they can use to compare companies and form an informed view about how they're managing their climate risk generally. And of course, this applies very specifically to whether CCS is actually doing anything to assist them in managing their climate risk or create opportunities for them going forward. So one of the challenges, I guess, is the variability in those reporting requirements, lack of standardization around ESG reporting generally and specifically for CCS. So I wouldn't mind asking you, Juho, Lipponen, what do you think government should do to support the development and application of rigorous and uniform reporting regimes for ESG and specifically for carbon capture and storage so that financiers, investors can actually easily compare apples with apples? You need to unmute, Juho.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for the easy question. Yeah, I think you said rigorous and uniform. I think there's two things there, I think, which are equally important. Maybe uniformity. Some thoughts first. I mean, I was also listening to Ian, your presentation, you said that you were looking into 15 most prominent reporting schemes. And I was wondering, how many schemes are there if you only looked at 15 that are most prominent? So clearly, I think this is an issue. I don't think I'm qualified to comment on the uniformity of all these ESG reporting requirements and reporting frameworks globally. I think, Ian, you mentioned the ISSB work that is starting to look into that. I think that probably is a good way forward, but certainly it seems that you need some uniformity in these reporting requirements. In some ways, being at the start of something can also be an advantage if you think that now GCCSI report, for example, you're proposing a framework. Well, in some ways, if we could think of that as the CCS block that could fit in various reporting requirements, maybe there's a way to actually make it more simple when you actually start from scratch. Try to make it uniform to all from the start. I think maybe we have an advantage here in the next number of months or years to create that from the start. The other objective was rigorous, and I think a backbone absolutely has to be the solid norms and rules and laws, however it is in countries that are there to ensure safe long-term storage of CO2 underground. If you don't have that, then it doesn't make much sense to be reporting. So I think that has to be the absolute backbone or the rock on top of which all of these support reporting mechanisms rest. And I think CCS in some ways can be quite straightforward here, because if operators operate according to those rules and norms, they will know exactly how much CO2 they inject underground. And I think there's less moving parts here than in some other areas of, like, if you think of reforestations, for example. So I think the GCCSI proposed framework can really be an interesting starting point here. Now, the role for governments in general, looking at the report and the proposed mechanism, what's interesting, that is quite broad. There's a lot of different segments to it. I wonder if governments need to be involved in all of them. I would say no. I think there are probably areas there that are very well handled by the market and by perhaps the finance sector, international conventions, and so forth. But then, for example, reporting on scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, that hardcore, maybe there indeed there could be a role for governments to look at how that is done the best way possible. Also, the taxonomies that have been coming out recently, I think, have a strong link here and can support the ESG theme as well. So in some ways, defining the role of government is one thing. Another consideration on the role of government is that really, I think this requires linking of energy, environment, and finance sector regulators. And I'm not convinced that they talk freely amongst each other and do each other these days everywhere. Maybe in some countries they do, in some countries certainly not. So I think there's work to be done on government level to actually bringing these relevant regulators together. And finally, I think the Institute proposed reporting framework should be taken on a bit of a tour. Maybe our group can help bringing country by country some key regulators and finance sector groups together and just simply talk through this, see how this fits in different countries, and start from that.
We may well take you up on that offer. Thank you, Juho. So we'll chat later.
Yeah, Alex, just one quick
so
question.
I'd like to ask.
Can I just quickly ask you one more thing on this reporting? Because Juho, how do you look at, for example, report elements like storage capacity? Yeah, because we see various projects now in various countries like the UK, Norway, Netherlands, but also other areas. And that injectivity volume, for example, is I think an important one. Also for the financial sector, for example, there are systems in place, but they're maybe not used everywhere. And same for the safety-related issues. There's a lot of safety-related issues that you can consider there as well. How do you look at that? Is that something that governments could sort of cooperate to make it more uniform? What's your view on that?
I will offer a quick view and then I'll hand over to Ian. So I think if there was to be a reporting methodology that describes CCS, it should require that there be clear, transparent statements of capacity and injection rate, for example. The methodology wouldn't specify how those particular parameters should be calculated, but it should refer to approved processes and methods that might be approved under relevant local regulation. So Ian, do you want to come in and just save me, please?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think it's almost the uniformity aspect, providing a benchmark level. I mean, it may not be exhaustive, but certainly a standard that you'd expect to see within reporting, and that's very clear. If you look at some of the reporting that's been provided to date, and I won't just flatter Shell, but some of the other organizations that are working on CCS, their reporting is very fulsome at the moment on CCS, and it addresses some of those issues that financiers had highlighted as wanting to see information on. It does meet that threshold because they're very fulsome in the level of detail that they're providing. So I think you would do the same or request the same type of information for some of the issues that Mark raised, and try and bring a certain level of sort of regulatory, almost a regulatory standard to it at some element to ensure that what's being reported is in line with that.
Thanks, Ian. Question for Adam. So one of the other observations of the report was that we've seen ESG reporting move from historically all voluntary. Now there are some mandatory aspects to it. It's being picked up as under financial reporting, for example, having to report ESG risks under corporations laws in various jurisdictions. What do you think is best? Do you think a voluntary approach to reporting ESG is the most efficient and effective way forwards? Once again, specifically applied to CCS, or do you think a regulated approach, similar to what's required under FSB for financial reporting, for example, that level of stipulation? How would you like to see this evolve, Adam, if you could wave a magic wand and make it so?
So, Alex, I think I see your question. Kind of the answer is two parts, but it's actually interesting because it gets at a couple of the questions that have been asked in chat and Q&A. Belinda Perriman asked about leakage in a plant and what would be done about that. Hans Majdi asked about, couldn't this just end up being greenwashing? And this is a concern that everybody has, I believe. So the two parts that I'd like to address, and it's very quick, and you've heard these words already on the webinar today. I think standardized measurement and transparency protocols are critical. That's why the proposal, this effort by GCCSI is so important. It's kind of the coalition of the willing, and Juho's idea of let's take this on the road and see, whether people could accept it. It's likely to be voluntary because I think getting a global agreement on anything is going to be very, very difficult. But, there are some examples. You have the Financial Accounting Standards Board. You mentioned financial accounting, Alex. You got the generally accepted accounting practices, GAAP, UK, that kind of thing. I mean, so we kind of know how to do this in some areas, and we need to just apply that thinking in others. On the mandatory aspect, I think that there is a place for that in individual countries. I mean, individual countries could mandate particular regulations that are based on their own national circumstances, and we can all hope that those mandates would be compatible with or parallel with this idea of voluntary standards that could be driven by private organizations. So back to you, Alex.
Thank you. Excellent response. Okay, so let's look at these questions and get some more questions from the audience now, I think. There's a question here from Belinda. I think you may have already mentioned her, Adam, and it gets at a risk associated with reporting. And I'd like to put this one to Ian, actually. So Belinda says, is there a tension between asking companies to report their CCS targets and other stakeholders putting a squeeze on them? And they're already low or zero returns to meet their targets. So for example, another way of putting that is there a tension around requiring a company to report its targets, and then what happens if it doesn't meet them? Is there a risk to that company, Ian? Is there a risk of litigation, for example, against a company for making declarations around how they're mitigating their climate risk and they're not living up to those declarations? How do you see that issue?
I look at the latter part. There is a risk, yeah, and that's probably one of the greatest tensions here, which is why companies are very careful in the nature in which they report presently. They don't want to step above where what they're trying to commit to, largely because of they're going to be held accountable. Their directors will be held accountable. So there is a bit of a tension here in that you have potentially financiers and the wider public wanting a greater level of information, and then a limit to what companies are realistically willing to provide. In terms of litigation, that's very much a real threat. We have seen litigation launched around the world now, including a case here in Australia, launched against company directors, and statements where they have made, statements that they have made in their annual reports in relation to their net zero commitments, where they're now being challenged as to the veracity of those claims. And that's, ultimately that litigation may fail, but from a public perception basis and a corporate, as a corporate risk, that's a real challenge and a cost associated with that as well. So there is quite significant risk here. It's finding a middle ground, I think, which is why this is so important.
Alex, just a quick intervention. Belinda's got another good question. I mean, is it a waste product? What would really be great is if the advancement of technology would drive us towards carbon dioxide as a valuable product. It's possible. There are recycle and reuse options. Here in Saudi Arabia, SABIC has been using carbon dioxide to make urea fertilizers and methanol. And you can use carbon dioxide in concrete to strengthen it, lighten it. These are expensive now, and Belinda talked about that. I mean, the cost side, but I think that with enough effort in terms of pilot plants and demonstration projects, government assistance in driving technology forward, that we can actually get to the point where this makes sense from a financial standpoint as an ongoing operation. Back to you.
That would be ideal, but as you intimated, I think that's some way off before we get to that point. I'm mindful that we are starting to run out of time. I'd like to touch on one more topic and get everyone's views on the panel before we wrap up, and that is the topic of greenwashing. So this, personally, I think this is a significant risk. And in fact, one of the audience asked the question, what specifically could be done to avoid greenwashing concerns amongst financiers, but more generally, greenwashing concerns amongst anyone who has a potential interest in this space. And I might just go around the panel and ask for your views, and I'd like to start with Stephen from Shell. Steve, what do you think? What do you think that we could do to really mitigate this risk of this just being seen as greenwashing?
It's a great question, and I think it's a real challenge. I mean, I think it's been said, if we can see common standards and benchmarks that really allow comparison of reporting and also improve transparency, and I think that will grow trust in what individual companies are saying. I think governments have a role there, but of course, financiers and companies do as well. So that would be my immediate answer.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Mark?
Yeah, I think it's indeed a very good question, but I think as long as the projects are obviously taking off a lot of carbon from hard to abate industries, and you can really prove that, and you see the immediate effect. And we can also prove that without this CCS solution, we will never reach the targets, the climate targets. Then I think there's a good support for that from the general public as well. So, but it is something we need to educate, and we need to explain that this is a temporary solution, but it is needed. And without this, we cannot reach our targets, specifically from steel and cement industry and so on. So yeah, we are also fighting a bit with that, but with the support of the government, with this project of common interest titles and so on from EU and Netherlands, and the coalition agreements within our political parties that take this into account. I think the support from the general public will come. I think that's my view.
Okay, thank you very much. Fatty, how do you think we can manage the risk of greenwashing?
Well, that's definitely a very difficult risk to manage. Well, however, I guess the key word here is standardization. Well, as there's obviously currently an ongoing effort to establish standard ESG guidelines by the International Sustainability Standard Boards, under the IFRS. I mean, this is something, we are already familiar with the current, risk assessment, regular risk assessment, and there is green type washing problems there as well. It's not called greenwashing, but, other types of risk washing. So, and as long as we have decent standards, well-established, globally established standards, that's gonna help solving one part of the problem. The other part is definitely going to be along with the transparency. Reporting transparency, and we have the auditing companies continuously auditing the firms, and continuous reports, updates coming into the markets, and investors do follow, and firms never want to lose their reputation, obviously. So transparency and standardization, I will say, are the keywords. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Juho.
Yeah, my word for this would really be measurability. I mean, we can today measure how much we capture, transport, and inject, and monitor how it behaves on the ground. The tools are there. I think ensuring that these are known and done in a transparent manner, that is a key aspect of avoiding greenwashing in this case.
Thank you. Adam?
This is really a hearts and minds kind of issue, isn't it? I mean, to me, this problem, which is serious, I mean, climate change, global temperature rise, everybody acknowledges that we have to do something, and every option has to be on the table. That's the whole concept of the circular carbon economy idea. You need remove, reuse, recycle, and including renewables. You need nuclear. You need all these things. I think it's greenwashing to say that we're gonna have aviation run by hydrogen or electric airplanes. That to me is greenwashing, but it doesn't often get portrayed that way. It's much more likely that biofuels with carbon capture and storage is a better way to fly airplanes, or a synthetic fuel made by recycling carbon dioxide and combining it with hydrogen. It makes more sense. So I'm back to the idea here, Alex, that the way we have to go after greenwashing is we've got to get on with everything that we can possibly do to address this problem, and that includes carbon capture and storage and all of the other things that will actually address managing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, methane control, for example. Back to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Final word for the primary author of the report, Ian. I'm sure you'll have something to add that hasn't already been said.
I'll do my best. Well, all of the above, and then in light of the conclusions of the report, perhaps some form of standardized approach that enables all parties to see beyond what would be greenwashing, providing a level playing field for this type of reporting, or an ESG framework of the type that we've tried to develop may provide that level playing field to ensure that there's no place to hide in terms of just making commitments without meeting them at a later date, and that the information being provided is could be scrutinized and seen by all. Sorry.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, sadly, we've run out of time, and we really do have to wrap this up. In fact, we're over time. I'd like to thank Adam, Juho, Fatty, Steve, Mark, and Ian for your time and for your wisdom. I'd like to thank KAPSARC for supporting this work, and for KAPSARC and the SEM for co-hosting this event with us. I think it's been a really good discussion. Thanks also to everyone who joined us today. The report is available to download. It's on our website, globalccsinstitute.com. Please visit and download it. It's free. We are publishing reports quite regularly, so keep a lookout for new reports and webinars describing them that we'll be publishing over the coming months. Of course, if you need any information at all on carbon capture and storage, visit our website. You'll find literally hundreds of reports that you can download we've put together over the past decade or so. And if your organization is interested in joining the Global CCS Institute, we'd love to hear from you. It really is a very exciting time for CCS. And with that, I will say goodbye and thank you for joining us, and hope to see you again at our next webinar, whenever that may be.